And I want to thank all of you for attending today. Our theme is My Time in Vietnam, Veterans' Personal Perspectives, which is sponsored by the Veterans Museum Broomfield and the City and County of Broomfield. I hope that by the time the symposium ends, you'll have a greater understanding of what some of the war's veterans went through, or if you're a veteran, you'll get to meet some people whose experiences mirror yours. A couple of administrative notes before we start. We have 2 bathroom breaks built into the schedule, plus a brief lunch break. To get to the bathrooms, go out the door in the back corner of the auditorium, go down the hallway between the library and the auditorium, and the restrooms are at the end of the hallway. And at around noon, we'll have some free refreshments in the lobby. We also have some donation jars if you care to make a monetary contribution to the museum. We certainly won't forbid you from doing that. The Board of Directors of the Veterans Museum Broomfield decided a few months ago to organize today's symposium marking the 60th anniversary of the beginning of the war. Now, there are a lot of other dates that could be used as the beginning, but we chose this particular one because, other than advisors, this was the time when America put boots on the ground in South Vietnam. We've gathered here a representative sampling of men and women who served during the war, who will tell you about their experiences, some sad, some funny, some heartbreaking. I'm sure that some of them are still haunted by some of the things that they saw and did. This is normal. Even veterans from all previous wars have had similar feelings. If there are any ancient Roman soldiers around, I'm sure they would admit to suffering from sword shock and spear trauma. But first, I'd like to welcome all the veterans from Vietnam to stand, or raise your hand if standing is not easy for you, so that the rest of us can acknowledge your service. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And one more thing before I begin, I'd like to thank a few museum people, my team, who helped put this whole thing together, and without whose untiring efforts it would not have been possible. I want to thank my second in command, Don Seigan, for helping put today's program together, and to Grady Birdsong, who did a fabulous job with our audio-visual portion, not only what you saw at the beginning, the video, but also throughout today when the veterans will be talking and showing slides of their service. And I would thank Craig Wolverton for his excellent job as the lobby czar and helping get things organized out there. It wasn't easy. We were only given a half hour to set everything up before the program began, but Craig and his team did a wonderful job there. And I'd also like to recognize Fred Martin, a friend of the museum, who did much to talk our final speaker, Orson Swindle III, into taking part. I also have another gentleman here who you'll hear from very shortly, Mike Fellows, who has been very instrumental behind the scenes, making sure things ran smoothly today. You'll also notice many people around today in red and blue vests. They're the volunteers from the museum, so be sure to thank them too. Now on with the program. Unfortunately, because of our compressed time frame and the number of people we wanted to have speak today, we don't have time for questions, but I'm sure that all of our speakers will be willing to talk to you, answer questions during our break time or after the day is over. So please hold your questions for that time. I'd now like to spend the next 12 minutes or so giving you a summary of the events that led up to America's involvement in Vietnam and why and how that involvement ended. This is me 60 years ago. That title of the book is really true. We were soldiers once and young, and we were. Um, well, I don't want to talk too much about myself at this point. I want to give you the backstory. But I was stationed outside of Saigon at a place called Long Bin, and I'll go into that a little more later. But let's begin with a little history lesson. Don't go to sleep on me. There will be a quiz later and it counts for half your grade, so pay attention. The road to victory, the road to America's involvement in Vietnam began with the victory at the end of World War II. The end of World War II also spelled the end for colonialism. Britain lost India, and Belgium's, Holland's, and France's overseas holdings were also headed for independence. Part of French Indochina became Vietnam. By the way, the traditional spelling is Vietnam, two words, which means people of the South, that is, south of China. France had colonized Vietnam in 1887, along with Siam, which became Cambodia, and Laos to create French Indochina. But the locals had always chafed under the control of a foreign power. In the 1920s and 30s, the idea of communism was spreading rapidly, and it found support among Vietnamese radicals. The founding of the Communist Party of Vietnam in 1930 was an important milestone in Vietnamese history. During World War II, the Japanese invaded and took control of most of Southeast Asia, with guerrilla forces doing battle with their occupiers. The American OSS, forerunner of today's CIA, sent in advisors to help the Viet Minh in their battle against the Japanese. After the war, the French came back, ready to resume their control of Vietnam, but the Vietnamese were not having any of that. Ho Chi Minh, the head of the Communist Party in Vietnam, asked the U.S. for help in kicking out the French, but the U.S. declined. After all, the French were our oldest allies, and the communists were, well, communists. In August 1945, under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, the Vietnamese people launched an uprising to seize control of their country from France, and the so-called Democratic Republic of Vietnam was proclaimed in September of 1945. Because France was unwilling to relinquish control of Indochina and the U.S. wouldn't help, the previously mentioned Viet Minh took up the fight against the French to gain independence. The Viet Minh later morphed into the Viet Cong, or VC. The post-World War II years saw additional rising tensions. The Soviet Union gained control of Eastern Europe, and along with Red China, which had just won a civil war, was seeking to expand communism in the East. A clash with Western democracies was inevitable. The Korean War saw how this battle of Cold War ideologies could quickly escalate into a hot war. Vietnam's struggle with France lasted until March of 1954, when the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu by Ho and his general Vo Nguyen Giap. A ceasefire was agreed to at the Geneva Accord of that year. According to the Geneva Accord, the country was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel into two territories, North and South Vietnam, which were expected to be reunified 2 years later following a general election. The U.S. and South Vietnam did not sign the accord, and the elections never took place. South Vietnam became ruled by a pro-U.S. government in Saigon. You all know about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that was formed in 1949 to defend against a possible Soviet incursion into Western Europe. Well, to prevent a communist takeover of South Vietnam and other countries in Southeast Asia, the United States in September of 1954 created an organization called SEATO, for the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Like NATO, it consisted of a coalition of nations that you see here to provide for the collective defense, and were bound by treaty to provide mutual aid if one of them were attacked. The question has also often been raised, was SEATO necessary? Well, a popular concept of the time was the domino theory. That is, if one nation in Southeast Asia fell to the communists, then the entire region would fall. And so, with the communists at war against the people and government of South Vietnam, the SEATO nations were treaty-bound to come to their aid. In the late 1950s, President Dwight D. Eisenhower sent a small group of military advisors to help train the South Vietnamese army to resist the communists, but without much success. Although the U.S. had supported the Viet Minh in World War II against Japan, Communist North Vietnam was now the enemy, and Ike felt it necessary to bolster the South Vietnamese. Ike, meanwhile, at this time, had his hands full dealing with Stalin and Mao Zedong. In December 1960, the Viet Minh became the National Liberation Front, soon to be known as the Viet Cong, or VC. In 1961, newly elected American President John F. Kennedy declared in his inaugural address, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, and oppose any foe in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty." I remember being inspired by those words and decided to serve my country when I graduated from college. The next year, Kennedy sent a larger group of military advisors who would eventually number about 25,000. But within Kennedy's administration, there were widely diverging opinions on how best to halt the communist insurgency. In September 1963, Kennedy said that in the end, it was South Vietnam's war to win or lose. We can help them, we can give them equipment, we can send our men out there as advisors, but the people of Vietnam have to win it against the communists. But I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw. That would be a great mistake. The United States made this effort to defend Europe. Now Europe is quite secure. We also have to participate, we may not like it, in the defense of Asia. And Kennedy was assassinated 2 months later. In early August of 1964, an event called the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred. Supposedly 2 American destroyers were attacked off the coast of North Vietnam, which led Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and U.S. officials to greatly escalate U.S. military involvement. Subsequently, it's believed that misinterpreted communications led to the sending of hundreds of thousands of Americans to take over most of the bulk of the fighting from the South Vietnamese army. Here, the first contingent of American ground forces is shown arriving near Da Nang in March 1965. The actual date of this was just 2 weeks ago. Some advisors proposed that Johnson invade North Vietnam, but others feared that doing that would provoke the Chinese into sending their troops, as it happened in Korea. Instead, the North was heavily bombed. Initially, the majority of Americans supported the war effort, but as time went on and casualties mounted and victory seemed elusive, many Americans began protesting the war. The military draft was especially unpopular among the young. By 1968, despite having been militarily defeated throughout South Vietnam for 4 years, the communists decided to make one last throw of the dice and planned a spectacular offensive that they hoped would cause the Southerners to rise up, join them, and expel the Allies. That operation was called the Tet Offensive. It was launched on the 30th of January, 1968, during the Lunar New Year festivities, all across the South and into the major cities. As you can see from this map, my pointer will work. No, it's not going to work. Try that one. There we go. Unlike Korea, which was a peninsula surrounded on 3 sides by water, the Vietnamese peninsula was surrounded on the west side by land, and that gave the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong the perfect opportunity to filter down the Ho Chi Minh Trail undetected. We had a certain restriction against our forces going into Cambodia or Laos, and so the enemy was able to penetrate the western border of South Vietnam. By all accounts, the communist offensive, although a tactical surprise, much like the Germans' last gasp effort to stop the Allies during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 was a military disaster. Except for a few places, such as Hue City and the Cholan district of Saigon, the VC and NVA were quickly defeated, and the South Vietnamese countryside, which had once been overrun by the communists, was now securely under government control. However, the American news media portrayed Tet as a communist victory. The American media's negative reporting added to the national trauma, causing many Americans to become disillusioned with General Westmoreland's leadership and earlier pronouncements that the end of the war and an Allied victory was within sight. In February of 1968, a month into the Tet Offensive, Walter Cronkite, the most respected American news anchor, reported from Vietnam. He said, "To say that we are mired in a stalemate," that slide's not there, seems the only realistic yet unsatisfactory conclusion. American public support for the war seriously eroded after that pronouncement. President Johnson decided not to seek re-election, and he was succeeded in 1969 by Richard Nixon, who promised to end the war. The military effort officially ended on 29 March 1973, after the Paris Peace Accord was signed and American forces began leaving the country. The POWs were released and American troops withdrew. Only the U.S. Embassy and a few thousand Department of Defense personnel remained. After the last American forces pulled out, the communists renewed their efforts to take over all of South Vietnam, which they did. The South did its best to resist without U.S. aid, but in April 1975, the VC and NVA overran Saigon, and there was a mad rush to escape. Tens of thousands of South Vietnamese civilians who survived the war did their best to escape the terror that was coming. But thousands more became victims of communist terror. Those who weren't killed spent years in re-education camps. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam was renamed the Socialist Republic of Vietnam in April 1976, and in 1977, Vietnam became a member of the United Nations. I want to say here, Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and the U.S. recognized the Vietnamese government in 1995. In the intervening years, many American veterans, including myself, have returned to Vietnam to find a prosperous, peaceful country that is now one of America's major trading partners, and a people who warmly welcome their one-time enemy. Swords have truly been turned into plowshares. During the 2 decades of fighting, over 2 million Americans served in Vietnam. More than 58,000 died, including 620 Coloradans, and over 300,000 were wounded. The communists lost much more, upwards of 1 million killed, yet they were successful and we were not. So why not? One reason is because of hubris, a sense that we as Americans could accomplish anything. The U.S. had the strongest, best trained, and best equipped military force in the world. We had put men on the moon, and just 20 years before, we had won the biggest, baddest world war in history. There was nothing we could not do if we put our minds to it, or so we thought. I think we were a little too overconfident. Also, we had no winning strategy. Invading and defeating the North was never the end game, for fear that the Soviets or Red Chinese would interfere. We just wanted the North to stop attacking the South. It was kind of like a football coach telling his team, "Okay, men, let's go out there and play for a tie." Finally, we lacked the will to win. Vietnam had long resisted attempts by foreigners to rule them. The North had a greater will to win than SEATO did, no matter how heavy the price of victory was on their side. And perhaps most importantly, they were fighting on and for their homeland. I think we can draw a parallel with our own Revolutionary War, in which we were fighting on and for our homeland against the greatest military force in the world at that time. So I guess you could call Ho Chi Minh the George Washington of Vietnam. It's ironic that in the end, the war divided a united country, ours, and united a divided one, theirs. Maybe it's something to think about. And so let's begin our program for the day. As long as I'm up here, there's Saigon today. You can see it, quite the modern city. That was where I was stationed at Long Bin headquarters outside of Saigon. And fortunately, I never had to go out into the jungle hunting for the enemy. They came to see me. About the only excitement for me was arriving in South Vietnam the day before the Tet Offensive began. My most meaningful assignment came after Vietnam, when I was posted to Fort Carson for my 5th and final year in the Army. The post randomly assigned officers to a duty called Emergency Notification Officer, and one day in September 1969, it was my turn. I was informed that morning that the son of a local family had been killed in Vietnam, and so it became my duty to deliver this tragic news to the family and make arrangements for the funeral. I still remember details of that day and feel it was the most important assignment that I had in my entire 5 years in the Army.